And the next set of ratios that we're going to talk about now, these are called leverage ratio. And all leverage ratios now measure the extent to which the firm is financed by debt. All things being equal, how much debt do you want a company to have? You want a company to have little debt as opposed to a lot of debt. The more debt you have, the greater your interest expense, the greater the chances of you going bankrupt. You can't pay the interest on the debt. So again, all things being equal now, you prefer debt to be smaller as opposed to larger. Now the most common debt ratio there is now is indeed called the debt ratio. And the debt ratio is defined as total debt over total assets. So total debt, what is that? Well, total debt is current debt plus long-term debt. That's total debt. And you're going to divide that by total assets. So if the total debt of a company, if you had the total debt of the company and divided it by its total assets, and this came out to be, in your calculator, 0.62. Now that's the decimal equivalent of 62%. And what that means now is that 62% of the assets of the firm are financed by some form of debt. What's the greatest this number could be? 1 or 100%. All of its assets are financed by debt. What's the smallest it could be? 0. None of the assets are financed by debt. 0.62. 62% of the assets are financed by debt. This is called the debt ratio. Another common leverage ratio now is called the long-term debt ratio. And it's defined as long-term debt divided by total assets. The only thing in the numerator is long-term debt, no current debt. So this looks at the long-term financing of the company's assets. If you took the long-term debt off the balance sheet and divided by the total assets rather, and it came out to be 0.42, well, that's the decimal equivalent of 42%. And what that means now is that 42% of the assets of the firm are financed by some form of long-term debt. What's the largest this number could be? 1 or 100%. That is, all of the assets are financed by long-term debt. The smallest it could be would be 0. None of the assets are financed by long-term debt. Again, the long-term debt ratio looks at how much of the total assets of the firm now are financed by long-term debt. And again, called the long-term debt ratio. Now, probably one of the, certainly in banking and investment circles, one of the better known financial ratios now is known as the equity multiplier, or the asset to equity ratio. And it's defined as total assets over equity. Now, equity to a banker, to an analyst now, are these two things right here: common stock and retained earnings. These represent the owner's investment in the firm. Okay, equity. Now, total asset to equity ratio. Here's the meaning of this now. If you had a company, if you started a company now, and you bought $1 worth of assets, and you have to pay for those assets somehow, you're either going to pay for it with debt or equity. Well, if you paid for it with all equity, you put $1 in to finance it, your balance sheet would balance, and the asset to equity ratio would be 1. Now, an asset to equity ratio of 1 means the company has no debt. And the asset to equity ratio can never be less than 1. So as you look at the asset to equity ratio, the higher the number above 1, the greater the debt of the company, the greater the extent to which the firm is financed by debt. That's also true with the debt ratio. It's also true with the long-term debt ratio. The greater the ratio is what? The greater the extent to which the firm is financed by debt. The more debt a company has, the greater the bankruptcy risk. If you look at this little example I made over here about the asset to equity ratio, next year you still have your old asset and you decide to buy a new asset, another $1 worth of assets. You pay for the old asset with the equity, You're now going to pay for it with the debt, this new asset. Balance sheet balances. What's the asset to equity ratio? Well, 2/1 or 2. So as the asset to equity ratio rises, the greater the extent to which the firm is financed by debt. And again, the greater the debt of a company, the greater the bankruptcy risk, the greater the interest expense, and the greater the odds, the probability that you can't pay the interest on the debt. That's bankruptcy risk. Debt ratio, long-term debt ratio, and equity multiplier or asset to equity ratio. These three ratios now, the greater the number, the greater the extent to which the firm is financed by debt. All things being equal, you'd like these three numbers to be what? As low as possible, okay? These are leverage ratios. Another common leverage ratio now is called the times interest earn ratio, TIE. Some people refer to it as the tie ratio. But nonetheless, the times interest earn ratio. It's defined as EBIT over interest. You'll recall when we talked about the income statement, I told you that operating profit, or EBIT, was important because it's the earnings available for paying the interest on your debt. This is the interest on the debt that you owe. If the times interest earn ratio, let's just say it was 1. If a company's times interest ratio is 1, that means it owes $40,000 in interest and its operating profit's $40,000. That means you're kind of on the razor's edge here with bankruptcy. You're very close to bankruptcy, if not in bankruptcy. All things being equal, what do you want this number to do? You want it to be higher as opposed to lower. You'd rather it be 8 than 1. A times interest earn ratio of 8 would mean that this firm could pay the interest on its debt 8 times. Times interest earn ratio is a little different than these others. These others looked at the extent to which the firm is financed by debt. This ratio looks at the ability of the firm to pay the cost of the debt, the interest expense. That's just as important, all things being equal. If your times interest earn ratio is less than 1, that means your operating profit, your EBIT, is less than the interest. That means you can't pay the interest on your debt. You're bankrupt.